welcome back to another Blender training video. Today I want to take a look at how to customize your interface, because if you've been working in another 3D program like Maya, 3D Studio Max, Lightwave, Moto, and you come over to Blender, finding your way through Blender's interface so that you feel comfortable is really one of the most important things in order to get into the software and make it feel like home, right? So here I am looking at Lightwave on the left, and I've got Maya on the right. And one of the things you're going to notice in both cases is that I've got this quad view where I've got orthographic views, and then in the upper right I've got this perspective view. And if we launch over into Blender, you're going to notice right off the bat that that is not a quad view. And if we were to go up to the workspaces along the top, while these do change the configuration of the window space, none of these is a quad view. So one of the things we want to take a look at is how do we set that up and configure it to our liking. Right now, if we come back over to, let's say, to Maya, and we were to click in one of these viewports and press the space bar and let go, we're going to go into that as a full screen view. And if I press the space bar and let go again, I go back to a quad view. So if I wanted to jump over to this viewport here, I can just place my mouse in it, and then spacebar, I jump into that view, spacebar to jump out. Okay. Similarly, over inside of Lightwave, if I place my mouse into a viewport and press the 0 key, I go full screen into that view, and this is 0 on the numeric keypad. If I come over, let's say, to the top viewport and press 0 on the numeric keypad, I can jump into that view. And then also Lightwave has in the upper right corner this maximize viewport widget that I can click, and that will maximize or minimize that, constantly going back into that quad viewport. All right, so how do we set that up? How do we set it up so that we can jump into and out of a full screen space and set up a quad view that we can get into inside of Blender? So I'm going to jump over to Blender, and to start, if you look through these tabs, these workspace tabs, you're not going to find a quad viewport. And if you go into the available spaces, you also will not, for the preset spaces, you will also not find one of these. So what we need to do is we need to set one up on our own. And how do we do that? Well, for starters, we can go to the upper left or upper right corner of any viewport. Actually, we can do this from the lower corners as well. It doesn't really make much of a difference. Find a corner on your interface and then click and drag up, or click and drag to the right or the left to split that viewport into another set of viewports, right? So if I come to the upper left corner, I click and I drag, and I do it again, click and drag, and I can do it again and click and drag. And it's not uncommon for new users of Blender to inadvertently do this and find themselves in a situation where they don't know how to get out of this. Okay, so let's talk about 3 different ways to get out of this particular mess, and then we'll talk about setting up a quad view, and we'll talk about how to go in and out of a full screen view from that space. All right, so for starters, if you find yourself having pulled open a new window like this, one of the easiest ways to correct that is to place your mouse over the divider between the two. And if you were able to click and drag, you would see it stretch across like that. Okay. Right click at that point, and you'll see an option to join areas. All right. So if I click that, now I have a sort of a shadowed or ghosted arrow to the left. And if I place my mouse over the right, I get a shadowed arrow to the right. That's basically saying, which way do you want to collapse this into? So is the left viewport going to collapse into the right, or is the right viewport going to collapse into the left? And in this case, it doesn't really make much of a difference. I'll go ahead and click, and that combines those viewports. Okay. Now, what I cannot do is I cannot come down and collapse a single viewport down into multiple viewports. I can only collapse from the same number of viewports into the same number of viewports. So in this particular case, I've got one viewport here and another viewport here, and then there's a divider. If I click and drag there, okay, I can right click and say join areas. But if I were to come down here where I've got, let's say, one viewport, and now I've got one column and another column, and I were to drag that and then right click, you're going to see I don't have the option to join. All right, so you can only join into a like number of areas. So for this particular case, I could right click here and say join areas and then join that over. All right, now there is a second way to join these together. It's the same basic way as what you did when you split. So if I were to pull this across, okay, left click, pull to drag it across, the way to collapse is to grab one of those corners and click and drag back where it came from. So in this particular case, I'm going to click and I'm going to flick and drag back where it came from. All right, and the same rules apply. I cannot join when I have multiple viewports back into a single one, or a single can't go to multiple. So in this particular case, what I'd have to do is say, well, I've got these three and then I've got one on the side. So I need to collapse the three so that I can join back to the one, and I've got three over here. I'm going to have to join these three and then I can merge those and back. And it's not difficult. So if I click and flick up, click and flick up, and I come over to the left side here, click and drag to the left, and again from the bottom, click up, and I can click over, and now I've got two viewports. I can click and drag up. Okay, so splitting off your workspace is a good thing. This allows me to then come through and change with the icon in the upper left corner whether I want this to be maybe an outliner, or whether I want this to be a file browser, or maybe I want this to be an image viewer, right, or an image editor, all right, or just another 3D viewport. All right, so being able to split this off is a feature, not a bug. And just know that if you want to join it, you can right click and join, or you can find the corner, click and drag into the viewport, and it will go away. Now, there is another way to do this. If you've broken this down and all of a sudden you have a bunch of these and you didn't mean to, and you said to yourself, how do I get rid of all of this? I don't want this. And that is to do this. All right, we were working in the layout workspace, okay, and then we jumbled it all up. If I don't want to manually figure out, I can't click and drag here because it's split into two spaces, and I don't want to be bothered manually doing this. Simply come up to the top where the little plus icon is, click that, and then under General, you're going to see that we have Layout as a default. I'm going to just go ahead and choose that. That brings me back to the space exactly as it is pre-configured. All right. And now I can simply go back to this tab here, right click and choose Delete. All right. And then I can double click this new Workspace tab, get rid of the 001. I can right click it and say Reorder to the front. And now it's back exactly like it was before. Okay. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you've broken that out, just choose General and pick the workspace that you were in, and then delete the one that you mucked up, and everything will be fine. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at how to set up that quad viewport. All right, it should be pretty straightforward and easy now that you know that you can pull the interface apart like you can. So I'll start with the upper left corner. I'll click and drag to divide that roughly in half. And then I'll click and drag down to split that way, and I'll do the same thing on this side, and now I have my quad view. So to configure this so that it feels a little more familiar to me, coming from a Lightwave / Maya background, I'll set this upper left viewport to the top, and I'll do that by clicking on the Z. And then in order to make this a wireframe view, I'll just go ahead and change the shading from solid to wireframe. I'll do the same thing over here. I'll go ahead and set this, let's say, to the front view. That's looking down the Y-axis. And I'll change that to wireframe. I'll leave this as my perspective view. And I'll go ahead and set this to the right side. That's looking down the X-axis. I'll choose the X here and change that to wireframe. And now I've got my quad view. So how do I save this? Well, I just overwrote my layout tab. All right. So let's do this. Let's click the plus We'll come down to General and choose Layout. All right. That brings us back to our Layout tab. Now I want to come back over here to this one and double click in the name, and I'm going to call this Quad. Okay. Now I'll double click Layout and rename it. All right. And if I want, I can then take this, right click it, and say Reorder to the front. So now I've got my Layout view, and now I've got my Quad view. Now if I were to close the program now, this would all go away and I'd have to reset this up every time I start. But if I want this to persist so that it starts this way every time I launch Blender, I need to save this as a default. And the way to do that is to go to the File menu and to come down to Defaults and choose Save Startup File. So if I do that, it's going to give me the option to say, yes, do you want to do this? I'll go ahead and click Save the Startup File, and then we'll be in good shape. Okay, now if I close out of Blender and then I relaunch Blender once again, you're going to find that when it starts up, it brings me right back to that Quad interface. Okay, now if I didn't want that, if I wanted that as an option, but I wanted to make sure that I was always starting in the layout, then just simply switch to Layout, go back to File, and choose Defaults, Save Startup File, and then when you start, it will come back here again. Now, interestingly enough, if you go to Quad and you were to inadvertently click and drag, because that does happen now and again, that Quad view is stored now as a preset. If we go back to General, you'll see that Quad is now listed here, and we can add that Quad view in, and we can come back to the one that we mucked up, right click and say delete if we needed to. Okay, so that's certainly an option. Now, if I start off a new scene, and I come over to my Quad Viewport and I'm working happily in here and I want to maximize this view. All right, we saw that within Maya I could press the space bar, and within Lightwave I could either use one of the widgets or I could press the 0 on the numpad. Here inside of Blender, to go full screen in any one of these viewports is Control Spacebar. Okay, so if I place my mouse over the top view and hit Control Spacebar, I go full screen for that. Control Spacebar drops me back out again. Okay, and if that isn't easy to remember, you can right click on the header. Okay, so if we come up to the top area here, this is the header. If we right click on that, you'll see an option to maximize area, and you can see off to the right the keyboard shortcut is Control Spacebar. Okay, so it's not a button, but it is there. If you right click, you can say back to the tiled area, or I can right click here and say maximize area. Okay, but it's just as easy to hit Control Spacebar to jump out. So if you're used to a Quad view, this will allow you to quickly set that space up, and then just by simply saving your defaults, you can come back and begin to utilize the space and make this a little more like home. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been helpful. Until the next time, stay safe and happy blending.